Welcome to my videos. Microsoft AZ-104 latest exam questions and answers set 8. You have an Azure subscription that contains the resources in the following table. Store 1 contains a file share named data. Data contains 5,000 files. You need to synchronize the files in the file share named data to an on-premises server named Server 1. Which 3 actions should you perform? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Create a container instance. B. Register Server 1. C. Install the Azure File Sync agent on Server 1. D. Download an automation script. E. Create a sync group. Correct answer: B, C, E. You have an Azure subscription that contains the resources shown in the following table. The status of VM1 is running. You assign an Azure policy as shown in the exhibit. Click the Exhibit tab. You assign the policy by using the following parameters: Microsoft, Classic Network, Virtual Networks Microsoft, Network, Virtual Networks Microsoft, Compute, Virtual Machines. For each of the following statements, select Yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select No. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. Hot area. An administrator can move VNET1 to RG2. Statement: No. The state of VM1 changed to deallocated. Statement: Yes. An administrator can modify the address space of VNET2. Statement: No. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account. You have an on-premises server named Server 1 that runs Windows Server 2016. Server 1 has 2 terabytes of data. You need to transfer the data to the storage account by using the Azure Import/Export service. In which order should you perform the actions? To answer, move all actions from the list of actions to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. Note: more than one order of answer choices is correct. You will receive credit for any of the correct orders you select. Select and place. Actions. Action 1. Attach an external disk to Server 1 and then run WA import-export.x. Action 2. From the Azure portal, create an import job. Action 3. Detach the external disks from Server 1 and ship the disks to an Azure data center. Action 4. From the Azure portal, update the import job. You have Azure subscription that includes following Azure file shares. You have the following on-premises servers. You create a storage sync service named Sync1 and an Azure file sync group named Group 1. Group 1 uses Share 1 as a cloud endpoint. You register Server 1 and Server 2 in Sync1. You add D folder 1 on Server 1 as a server endpoint of Group 1. For each of the following statements, select Yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select Number. Share 2 can be added as a cloud endpoint for Group 1. Statement: No. E folder 2 on Server 1 can be added as a server endpoint for Group 1. Statement: Yes. D data on Server 2 can be added as a server endpoint for Group 1. Statement: Yes. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You create an Azure storage account named Contoso Storage, and then you create a file share named Data. Which UNC path should you include in a script that references files from the data file share? To answer, drag the appropriate values to the correct targets. Each value may be used once, more than once, or not at all. You may need to drag the split bar between panes or scroll to view content. Values: Contoso Storage, file.core.windows.net. Data. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure storage account. You plan to copy an on-premises virtual machine image to a container named VM Images. You need to create the container for the planned image. Which command should you run? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. Hot area. As copy make, https://mystorageaccount.blob.core.windows.net/vmimages. You have an Azure File Sync group that has the endpoints shown in the following table. Cloud tiering is enabled for endpoint 3. You add a file named File1 to endpoint 1 and a file named File2 to endpoint 2. On which endpoints will File 1 and File 2 be available within 24 hours of adding the files? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. Hot area. File 1. endpoint 3 only. File 2. Endpoint 1, endpoint 2, and endpoint 3. You have several Azure virtual machines on a virtual network named VNet1. You configure an Azure storage account as shown in the following exhibit. Use the drop-down menus to select the answer choice that completes each statement based on the information presented in the graphic. The virtual machines on the 10.2.9.0/24 subnet will have network connectivity to the file shares in the storage account never. Azure Backup will be able to back up the unmanaged hard disks of the virtual machines in the storage account never. You have a sync group named Sync1 that has a cloud endpoint. The cloud endpoint includes a file named file1.txt. Your on-premises network contains servers that run Windows Server 2016. The servers are configured as shown in the following table. You add Share1 as an endpoint for Sync1. 1 hour later, you add Share2 as an endpoint for Sync1. For each of the following statements, select Yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select No. On the cloud endpoint, file1.txt is overwritten by file1.txt from Share1 statement. Yes. On server 1, file1.txt is overwritten by file1.txt from the cloud endpoint statement. No. File1.txt from Share1 replicates to Share2 statement. Yes. You have an Azure subscription that contains the storage accounts shown in the following table. You need to identify which storage account can be converted to Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS, replication by requesting a live migration from Azure support. What should you identify? A. Storage 1. B. Storage 2. C. Storage 3. D. Storage 4. Correct answer. B. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account named Account 1. You plan to upload the disk files of a virtual machine to Account 1 from your on-premises network. The on-premises network uses a public IP address space of 131.107.1.0/24. You plan to use the disk files to provision an Azure virtual machine named VM1. VM1 will be attached to a virtual network named VNet1. VNet1 uses an IP address space of 192.168.0.0/24. You need to configure Account 1 to meet the following requirements. Ensure that you can upload the disk files to Account 1. Ensure that you can attach the disks to VM1. Prevent all other access to Account 1. Which two actions should you perform? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. From the networking blade of Account 1, select Selected Networks. B. From the networking blade of Account 1, select Allow Trusted Microsoft Services to access this storage account. C. From the networking blade of Account 1, add the 131.107.1.0/24 IP address range. D. From the networking blade of Account 1, add VNet1. E. From the service endpoints blade of VNet1, add a service endpoint. Correct answer: A and E. You have an on-premises file server named Server 1 that runs Windows Server 2016. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure file share. You deploy an Azure File Sync Storage Sync service, and you create a sync group. You need to synchronize files from Server 1 to Azure. Which 3 actions should you perform in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of actions to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. Actions. Step 1. Install the Azure File Sync agent on Server 1. Step 2. Register Server 1. Step 3. Add a server endpoint. You plan to create an Azure storage account in the Azure region of East US 2. You need to create a storage account that meets the following requirements. Replicates synchronously. Remains available if a single data center in the region fails. How should you configure the storage account? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Replication. Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS. Account type. Storage v2, General Purpose v2. You plan to use the Azure Import/Export service to copy files to a storage account. Which two files should you create before you prepare the drives for the import job? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. An XML manifest file. B. A dataset CSV file. C. A JSON configuration file. D. A PowerShell PS1 file. E. A drive set CSV file. Correct answer: B and E. You have a recovery service vault that you use to test backups. The test backups contain 2 protected virtual machines. You need to delete the recovery services vault. What should you do first? A. From the recovery service vault, delete the backup data. B. Modify the disaster recovery properties of each virtual machine. C. Modify the locks of each virtual machine. D. From the recovery service vault, stop the backup of each backup item. Correct answer: D. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that contains the resources shown in the following table. In Storage 1, you create a blob container named Blob 1 and a file share named Share 1. Which resources can be backed up to Vault 1 and Vault 2? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. Hot area. Can use Vault 1 for backups. VM1 only. Can use Vault 2 for backups. Share 1 only. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You have 5 terabytes of data that you need to transfer to Subscription 1. You plan to use an Azure Import/Export job. What can you use as the destination of the imported data? A. A virtual machine. B. An Azure Cosmos DB database. C. Azure File Storage. D. The Azure File Sync Storage Sync service. Correct answer: C. You have an Azure subscription. You create the Azure storage account shown in the following exhibit. Use the drop-down menus to select the answer choice that completes each statement based on the information presented in the graphic. The minimum number of copies of the storage account will be 3. To reduce the cost of infrequently accessed data in the storage account, you must modify the answer choice setting access tier default. You have an Azure storage account named Storage 1. You plan to use AS-Copy to copy data to Storage 1. You need to identify the storage services in Storage 1 to which you can copy the data. Which storage services should you identify? A. Blob, File, Table, and Queue. B. Blob and File only. C. File and Table only. D. File only. E. Blob, Table, and Queue only. Correct answer: B. You have an Azure storage account named Storage 1 that uses Azure Blob Storage and Azure File Storage. You need to use AS-Copy to copy data to the Blob Storage and File Storage in Storage 1. Which authentication method should you use for each type of storage? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Blob Storage, Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, and Shared Access Signatures, SAS, only. File Storage, Shared Access Signatures, SAS, only.